Now going to move on to round two, and in round two, the debaters talk to each other directly, and they also take questions from us. So on to round two, and I just want to ask Niall Ferguson, since your side is arguing that Wall Street should be blamed for the economic crisis, and we heard your, I'm sorry, Washington should be blamed for the economic crisis, and we heard your teammates say that Washington did not do its job well. My question really is, if Washington had performed its job well, would we have an economic crisis?
Well, I think one way of answering that question is to ask whether every country in the world is having a financial crisis comparable to the one that's being experienced in the United States. Now, most countries in the world are experiencing an economic crisis, largely as a consequence of what is happening here, but they're not all experiencing a financial crisis. You don't have to travel terribly far, actually, to get to a country where banks are and have been adequately regulated. That country is called Canada. So if you simply look at what's happened there, it becomes obvious that something was egregiously wrong with the regulatory environment in the United States, and that is our central point. It's not difficult to see that there was a grotesque failure on the part of regulators and politicians here. You only have to look north of the border.
Now, Minow, you're on the opposite side of the argument, but I see you nodding.
Well,
that's always a good sign.
You know, the fact is that the banks are supposed to be able to respond to whatever is provided to them in some kind of a rational way, and they didn't do that. As I said, they all relied too heavily on the same set of numbers. But I'm not sure that I think that that more regulation is the answer. Is that what you're arguing for?
On the contrary, I've never said I'm in favor of more regulation. Simply better regulation.
Well, in what way is it better?
Can I conclude my point? If you think back to the highly regulated financial markets of the 1970s, it's not as if that was a period without financial crisis. I'm old enough to remember stagflation and the secondary banking crisis in the UK, and the problems of that period were in many ways as serious. Certainly the recession of the early 1970s was as serious as anything we've experienced so far, though I don't rule out that this is going to get worse. So no, I'm not in favor of more regulation. The heavy regulations that were imposed during and after the Great Depression didn't actually prove to be that benign. The trouble is that the deregulation, much of which was justifiable, was taken to excess. This, I think, is the point that John Steele Gordon, Nouriel Roubini, and I want to stress. And it's not difficult, if one compares different regulatory frameworks around the world, to see why the US was so bad.
But don't you think the point that I made about $600 million being poured into Washington, they don't have that system in Canada either, for lobbying and for political campaign fundraising.
Let's let Nouriel Roubini come in and respond.
I think there's a strong correlation. It goes to history between degree of proper regulation and financial crisis. You know, after the Great Depression, we imposed a system of strong regulations of the financial system, capital controls, when for a few decades, there were not that many financial crises and banking crises. It's not just the US. If you look around for the last 20 years, you have had financial crises and banking crises and so on in a number of countries. And what has been changing for the last 20 years, starting with Ronald Reagan and then Margaret Thatcher, the ideology became of deregulation at any cost, first in advanced economies and then in emerging markets. Now, some deregulation was good. Nobody's in favor of excessive, and probably we swung the balance too much in the direction of too much regulation after the Great Depression, and that led to not enough financial innovation. But deregulation without appropriate institution and so on has been known to lead to financial crises, like in East Asia, like in Mexico, like in Argentina, and so on. And therefore, there is a strong correlation between the quality of the regulatory and supervisory regime and whether financial crisis occurs. It's a trade-off between the two, but that's what's leading to the fact that now, in spite of the great moderation, low inflation and growth, these financial crises are occurring now more frequently. Things should have occurred once every 1,000 years, now occur every other year. More frequently, more virulent, and more costly in every way.
Alex Berenson from the other side.
Certainly there has been a huge amount of deregulation in the last 20 years. There's also been major changes in the structure of Wall Street. Firms, Wall Street was essentially a set of partnerships largely until the 70s, and by the 90s, I think Goldman was the last big firm to give up the partnership model. So again, it's not your capital at risk anymore, it's your shareholders' capital at risk. You don't own your firm anymore, you own a portion of it. I don't think it's an accident that there are some small partnerships out there that have essentially thrived, maybe too strong a word, but they have survived this crisis. The other very, very important change, really the most important change, is the egregious increase in compensation. It's one thing if you're making, you know, $500,000 a year, let's say you're making some multiple of an average American salary, where if you do that for 10 years, you're very well off. It's another thing if one good year makes your life and makes your children's lives. It really skews your incentives.
John Steele Gordon.
I just want to point out that Nell has said that Wall Street spent $600 million lobbying Washington for regulations that Wall Street liked. I'm sure that's perfectly true. On the other hand, Washington took the money and produced the regulation.
Nell?
You know what? Washington has its own market system, and people have got to get reelected. That's what accountability is. Yeah, they took the money, but you know, you're blaming the victim there.
Now, do you want to respond to the audience response?
Yeah, sure. If you want to make this about campaign finance reform, I'd be happy to turn this into that debate, and I'd be happy to come back and have that debate. I'm totally in favor of that, but the United States is the only country in the world that has this level of corruption coming into politics from money, because this is the only country in the world that doesn't give free television time and forces politicians to buy the time. So you want to take money out of politics? I think that would be a great thing. I think it would be hugely beneficial in Washington, believe me. But you cannot blame Washington for the fact that all this money comes in from Wall Street.
I mean,
Niall Ferguson.
You know, Washington might be corrupt, but you have to think about the international dimension of this phenomenon. There are many countries with totally different laws about lobbying and so on, and there have been about 50 banking crises in the last 20 years, and have occurred in very different political regimes. And if there is something common among all of them, is that in most of these cases you had controlled financial system, and then deregulation occurred too fast and in ways that did not provide prudential regulation supervision of the financial system. As I said, you know, capitalism is based on greed. Greed is just about incentive, about maximizing returns. We're all greedy, you know. First of all, you said you are the only one from Washington. I spent 2 years at the White House and Treasury, and also ran a successful business. So I know about policy and I know about business. I tell you, in my business, I'm greedy and I react to incentives, but I want public policy to be setting rules and regulations so that I don't misbehave and I don't cheat and I don't lie and I don't take excessive risk with taxpayers' money.
Niall Ferguson has been very patient. Your teammate, Neil.
Nell, I'm still struggling to understand how the recipients of bribes are victims. I'm sorry. I have to tell you, I'm afraid your moral GPS just broke down on you there. Let me just say that this is absolute.
And in fact, if you look at the lobbying statistics, you'll see that half of the people that took the money voted against them anyway, which is part of politics too. But the point is, as you well know, people ran for office and were elected on policies of deregulation.
Hang on one moment.
Okay.
You've hit the nail on the head here. AIG spent $9.7 million on federal lobbying last year, in 1 year, and that was down on the previous year. It's contributed directly to candidates, to elected officials and parties, $9.3 million since 1989. It would have been much more, but for campaign finance limits. And the top recipients of the money include the chair of the Senate Finance Committee and the chair of the Senate Banking Committee. Now, if that doesn't tell you that something is morally rotten at the heart of Washington, I don't know what we have to show you.
If it doesn't tell you that something is...
I want to, Jim Chanos, you contrarian, you have been sitting there silently on the side against
Just because the Keystone cops couldn't catch the gang that couldn't shoot straight doesn't absolve that gang from its guilt. in not only looting the system with material intent, but materially abrogating their fiduciary responsibility to their clients and the nation.